and Wisdom Tree, I welcome you all to the release of the book India at 70, Modi at 3.5 by the Union Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Mr. Arun Jaitley. A reminder once again to kindly keep mobile phones in the silent mode. We are pleased to have with us the Union Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Mr. Arun Jaitley, and Mr. Shakti Sinha, the Director NMML, Dr. Vivek Debroy, Chairman, Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and Niti Aayog member, Mr. Swapan Dasgupta, Senior Journalist and Member of Parliament, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Director SBMRF, and Shobit Arya, the founder and publisher, Wisdom Tree. I'd like to begin by requesting the Director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Mr. Shakti Sinha, to please welcome all our guests.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome Shri Arun Jaitley, Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, Mr. Hardeep Puri, the Minister for Urban Affairs, Mr. Vivek Debroy, Swapan Dasgupta, Anirban, Shobit, and Ashok Malik on the way, and of course all of you. As you know, cricket is our national game. And why do I call it a national game? Because everybody in this country knows what Virat Kohli should be doing. Everybody without fail. They did that in the past with Dhoni and with Kapil Dev and with everybody else. And therefore, I always admire people in authority because everybody else seems to be knowing what they should be doing. Now, why do I say it? I don't have to elaborate. This is the time when I told you so is so important. This book, India at 70, Modi at 3.5, others will describe the book. But just the process, the last 3 years, every year without fail, Anirban has managed to get together the people to do this book. The first year was about governance, last it was called Modi Doctrine, and this year it is this. So I think you can see the evolution with time, getting more and more people, and each year the editing becomes tougher and tougher. So this year with Vivek Debroy, now the Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Committee, being a very strict and a tough taskmaster. Ashok was very gentle, so I can't blame Ashok. But there are good points in the book. These two gentlemen have a lot to do with that. Of course, I'm not in the thank you mode at the end. I'm supposed to just welcome you. So it always gives me great pleasure to be associated with this, books like this, events like this. It gives us a chance to reflect. It gives us all a chance to tell the government what the government should be doing. So with that, once again, let me welcome you. And let me repeat what she said. Please put your phones on silent mode, preferably flight mode. But you know, you have a very serious moment and suddenly in between, Lara's tune comes on. It's not always funny. Once again, welcome all of you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sinha. To tell us more on this initiative of annual volumes, I'd like to now request the Director of the Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation, Dr. Anirban Ganguly.
Thank you. My remarks will be very brief. I just want to say a few things. Since this is the season of speaking up, we at SPMRF have constantly felt the need to speak up because we wanted to say so many things simply because there's so much that is happening in India today, and it has been happening since the summer of 2014. Something that is repeatedly and constantly transformative. We thus decided to document the transforming India story and produce a volume every year so that this transformation is documented, discussed, and disseminated. Last year, as Shri Shakti Sinha pointed out, we did the Modi Doctrine. For me and for my very able co-editors, Dr. Uttam Sinha and Dr. Vijay Chauthaiwale, it was a most intense and fulfilling exercise. And Finance Minister wrote a foreword to it, setting the direction. Modi Doctrine initiated a new discourse on the fundamental shifts in India's foreign policy, as initiated by Prime Minister Modi. India at 70, Modi at 3.5 is the third volume in the series and covers a wide gamut and captures India's multi-sectoral transformation under Narendra Modi. A battery of experts and analysts have come together under two distinguished authors, thinkers, and public intellectuals to analyze and narrate the real story of India's transformation, a transformation that had been halted for the last 1 decade. In this effort of ours, we have always received FM's unstinted support. I look forward to continuing this effort and thank those of you who have supported the idea of this series. Speaking up for us is essential, especially today, when the story of India's real transformation, her real change towards the better, at times faces obfuscation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganguly. To elaborate on the book being released today, which is the third in the series, India at 70, Modi at 3.5, Capturing India's Transformation under Narendra Modi, we have both the editors, Professor Bibek Debroy and Mr. Ashok Malik, who's just joined us. I'd like to first invite Professor Bibek Debroy to please share his thoughts with us.
Honorable Finance Minister, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Dr. Shakti Sinha, Dr. Swapan Das Gupta, Ashok Malik, Shobit Arya, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize in advance. I've got a bit of a cold, so I apologize in case I happen to sneeze throughout the event. Probably slightly reminiscent of what is happening to the economy. Near where we live, there is a place called Yashwant Place. I went there, consulted a doctor who said this is a serious medical emergency. It might be chikungunya. You might die. I went to another more sensible doctor who said, look, you've just got a minor cold, relax. Give it a few days, it will pass. But this book is not about that. This book, as Anirban already said, is about the various things this government has done since it came into power in 2014. There are a lot of people who tend to be critical about what the government has not done. And whenever they criticize, everyone who criticizes tends to have his or her own lens through which it is defined what the government should be doing. So there is always inherently, and that's inevitable, a subjectivity in the criticism, because one tends to look at everything with a certain prism. I expected the government to do this, that, and the other, and it's not done that. Over several meetings, Anirban, Ashok, and Shobit, who's much more than a publisher, he brings a lot of wisdom as well, and we thought about what should we try to document. Let's begin
More than 70% of one government's term. These 3.5 years have been actually a little less than half of the 8-year period of transformation that the Prime Minister has spoken about. The transformation to a new India from 2014 to 2022, when India completes 75 years as a free country. So if we look at this transformation as a 26-mile marathon, we are at about mile 12 right now. So in that sense, anyone who says he knows the end picture doesn't quite know what he or she is talking about. What this end picture will be is for a future volume of the book to point out in some years. But I'd like to point out 4 or 5 themes that cut across the various sectors or areas this book looked at. From health, which is the topic I chose to write on, to urbanization, to any other subject. One, this period has seen more and more of the energy and policy making moving to the states. Even in the chapter on health, this becomes so apparent, where the increment in health spending is starting to happen because the states have more money. Maybe it's not apparent enough in 1 or 2 years, maybe it'll be more apparent in 5 years, but there's definitely a trend we are detecting. Second, a conscious effort towards urbanization, serious planned urbanization. Again, you will not get results in 2 years. You'll get results in maybe 5 years, maybe 7. But that serious effort has been made in a manner that had not been made previously by any government. Third, a focused look at clean energy, at industrialization
Now, maybe it is a marathon. I'm not so familiar with a sporting metaphor, which is not cricket. But in any case, it is a long haul. The creation of a new India also involves the creation of a purposeful government, it involves the creation of an energetic government, and it involves the creation of certain degree of sustained focus on the areas in which it's operating. And I hope you will view it. But for the moment, I think I won't take any further time. It is Mr. Jaitley who, for various reasons, has always attracted publicity, he's always attracted brickbats, and today we didn't give him a bouquet, we've given him a book instead. So I think Mr. Jaitley is being, everyone wants to hear Jaitley for the wrong reason today. So without any further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. May I now request the Union Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Mr. Arun Jaitley, to please release the book, which is in front of you, sir, and then address the gathering. If everybody on the stage could please hold up the book. Yes. Mr. Jaitley, if you could address the gathering, please.
Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Shakti Sinha, Shri Bibek Debroy, Dr. Swapan Das Gupta, Ashok Malik, Shobit Arya and friends. Let me at the very outset thank Anirban for having continued this debate year after year and bringing out this annual publication which reflects a very strong point of view. Vivek and Ashok Malik have jointly edited the book and they deserve to be complimented. I have the privilege of knowing both of them. And I was asking Vivek that temperamentally they are so different. How did they put it together? And Vivek's candid reply was they just had to write the introduction. And therefore that was not a very difficult job. Swapan was emphatic in making a point about there being several issues even outside the economy, particularly in relation to how India is emerging at 70. I've said this a few days earlier at another function last Sunday, and if I may briefly make the point that there is a new ideological divergence which is now emerging in India, which conventionally in the last 70 years wasn't there. And the last 3.5 years particularly have seen this happening very emphatically. In a democracy, ideological polarizations will always take place. And I can see across the country a new ideological polarization taking place in terms of both acting in tandem and on several issues taking a stand in convergence amongst the ultra-left in India and the extreme jihadi elements across the country. And therefore, the alternative ideological pole to the one that we represent is now converging around this particular thought. And this is quite evident. Their electoral base is very narrow. And therefore, if they were to contest elections, probably winning seats would be extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible. But if we look at areas, particularly university campuses, media, some writers, what were the kind of decisions which political leadership in the past at time would think twice before taking. I think the kind of integration with the global economy we brought about by opening up the economy step by step. We not only opened up several sectors, we made the entry smoother, and we eventually found that 95% of all investment coming into India was coming by the automatic route. And therefore, was the FIPB necessary at all? Because it was only duplication of the permissions itself. We then, if you draw from your memory, how all files for environmental clearance used to travel to Chennai, and that regime had to end. And I'm glad it ended. And therefore, permissions became relatively easier. Crowds around North Block, South Block disappeared. And then slowly, in each sector which needed to be changed, and let us just examine how political corruption in New Delhi has been tackled. The genesis of the New Delhi corruption was discretions. And because you had discretions, and because you also have discretions accompanied by a non-transparent political funding mechanism, so this led to exercise of discretions for collateral purposes. So in the first year itself, the Prime Minister laid down an agenda and said, allocation of resources, discretions, just eliminate them. And therefore, let the market mechanism decide. And we've been much better off. And therefore, small areas which paralyzed at least UPA 2 because of this discretions being used and misused, we were completely able to distance ourselves from these discretions itself. Then came the bigger challenges. I've already announced this year, and I'm keen to implement it. It's in the final stages. How do we legitimize the political funding in India so that the underground funding itself comes to an end and an alternate mechanism is set in? The Prime Minister had a very strong agenda on creating a new normal as far as India's shadow economy was concerned. It had actually corrupted us as a society. It had tarnished our image globally. There was no way in India you could do business without relying on the alternative mechanisms of payment. Properties had to be bought in two colors of money. Many businesses had to maintain parallel books of accounts. And therefore, something which the UPA didn't do since 2011, the first decision, we accepted the SIT. We gave an opportunity to people to come out clean on assets illegally held abroad. We brought a strong legislation against that. We started entering into various transactions through G20 and other bilateral transactions with countries so that information in real time comes. We've started prosecuting people whose assets were found abroad. The Benami law was a typical case where the law was originally passed in 1988 by Rajiv Gandhi. The law ministry said it can't be implemented, rules can't be framed. So it remained on paper. So I got it approved by Parliament, put it into action. And this whole business of shell companies and rotating money through these shell companies. And it's not merely businesses. We've also started with politicians who did it. And the color of politicians doing it defies their political ideology. And therefore, the strong action being taken under the Benami law against these transactions is sending its own signals. Since 1996, we were trying to renegotiate Mauritius, Cyprus, Singapore. When the economy was more vulnerable, we had entered into these dual taxation treaties. And now, of course, we didn't need this money. Most of it was round-tripping. So last year, we renegotiated all three of them. And then came this very strong action on the demonetization itself. Now, if somebody had closely watched the government, from financial inclusion to insisting on bank accounts, downwards, each one of those actions, and then the entire effort is to subvert a debate as though the demonetization was synonymous with confiscation of currency. Well, demonetization was intended to make sure that this anonymous tender, which operates in the market, gets identified to its owner. So when it gets identified to its owner by way of a compulsory deposit into the banks, the money doesn't change colors. Those who can't account for it will have to pay the necessary taxes for it. And the object, because those who criticized it, this shadow economy or black money continuing under that old normal, and changing that old normal was never a part of their political agenda. And therefore they started singing virtues of cash itself. So the whole object was, you end that anonymity, identify it with the owner, expand the tax base, certainly of the personal income tax base, for digitization, expand the footprints. The transactions doubled in a matter of days, slipped a little and are now moving up. And then for the future, make sure that the process it has started where the high denominational currency already stands compressed, this process of compression goes on. And I think it successfully moved in that direction. Well, people saw that riots would begin, starvation would take place, and this became one of the smoothest possible replacements of currency itself. On the GST, it was everybody's call that a single tax comes. And I must confess that even when some leaders of the Congress party made critical statements, I have to be more than fair to their state governments and their finance ministers who knew the merits of what was happening. And therefore, on top, if I look at it today, the decision-making mechanism in India's first federal institution itself has institutionalized itself. I have the numbers on my side, but I have never put anything to vote in the 21 meetings which last 8 to 10 hours each. We work out consensus. The legislations are by consensus. The rates are by consensus. All steps are by consensus. There is a grievance redressal, very powerful mechanism. We meet regularly. And then those who had pushed this country into a policy paralysis, when they saw it coming, said, please postpone it. And I must say, to the credit of at least two of the Congress finance ministers of the states, who walked up to me in the GST Council, and one of them said, sir, please don't blink. If you do, it'll get derailed indefinitely. And then what do we get? We are now just finished the second month. So as a base year of 2015-16, we have to give 2 hike-ups of 14% each to the states. And for both the months, with some part of the compensation cess, we are well within that figure. I at least never imagined that for the states we'll reach the break-even point in the first 2-3 months itself. And therefore, one does expect some teething problems to come up, particularly the lowering of the compliance burden as far as the small sector is concerned, small and medium sector is concerned. We've been having continuous meetings how to do it, and probably we will do it. But the whole process has been put into action. And the likelihood of revenues is almost reaching, in the initial months, the anticipated figure. And therefore, as we'll walk down the next couple of months, we probably will move up. Before coming for today's meeting, I just checked up. Even the direct tax figures, as of today, are 15.7% over and above last year. So this so-called slowdown, which some visualize, hasn't impacted that. And of course, as I mentioned, the GST itself, because the only relaxation which we are making is 95% of the GST revenue comes from only 4 lakh assessees. The balance over 6 million pay only 5%. And these 6 million take their own time because of compliance burdens, and they slowly keep filing it. And that's something which we'll have to live with even in normal taxation. It's nothing very significant. How do you then invest? What has this led to? And when you speak in terms of Modi 3.5, when we took over, the first 17 highway contracts didn't attract a single bidder. And the reason was very clear, that we had almost bankrupted everybody who was in the business of building highways. And today you are back at 20 plus kilometers a day. This year you are close to 4 lakh crores of the union budget as far as infrastructure is concerned. Today I took a meeting of the public sector undertakings. This year their capital expenditure is another 3 lakhs, which is outside the union budget. The FDI coming into the country continues to be the largest ever. I don't recollect the first 3 years of this government emerging from a policy paralysis. After all, growth rates are relatable to several factors. One of the factors is how are you fitting into the world? Is the world supportive, or is the global economy stopping you from growing? There was a period from 2003 to 2008 where we grew with the global trend. And then the world slowed down. But we became the fastest growing economy for the first 3 years, the major economy. And of course, in economies, you will continue to face challenges. We've had great challenges in the past also. 1991, the middle of 1991, today we have over 400 billion of foreign reserves. What was the foreign reserve left? Less than 4 billion. So those successful men who managed the affairs in 1991, we were left with less than 4 billion. Mr. Vajpayee's government, if you look at 1998 to 2002, the NPA figure was a staggering 15%, 14%, 12%. And how did it get tackled? The RBI then radically brought down the rates. And when the rates, interest rates had come down, the value of the G-Secs had gone up, and therefore, and this was coupled with the first important legislation that the government brought, the securitization law, Sarfazi as we call it. And a combination of these factors then brought the whole figure down. What are the challenges that I see? I, of course, see an important challenge that after having gone through the effect of demonetization and had its advantages, some impact in the slowdown, but a positive long-term impact. Some impact in the short term, but a positive medium-term and long-term impact. And this 15.7% increase in direct taxes I have just mentioned is really because the personal income tax base is expanding. All those people who deposited money in the banks have now to account for them. And the effect is, and today the challenge really is, that during the boom period 2003 to 2008-9, our private sector expanded. Global economy slowed down. They had expanded beyond a point. They had undertaken large liabilities from banks. They didn't find a demand. Global commodity prices went down. And many of them have found their loans unserviceable. And then came a situation, 2012 to 14, where the government had virtually given up. There was no policy initiative, there was no step to be taken. You allowed things to drift on their own. And when you allowed things to drift on their own, the figure mounted up. And I must say that those in the government, those in the banking industry, those in the central bank, the Reserve Bank, when reckless lending took place, were all looking the other way. And then suddenly, some harsh steps were required. So the debate is, are those steps which have been taken a bit too harsh? Particularly the steps with regard, the bankers believe that the steps with regard to excessive provisioning are a bit too hard on them. And therefore, the private sector investment itself is one area where we have not grown. Several areas of private sector have grown. There are many industries which have invested. I've been speaking to a large number of them. I just mentioned the CPSUs itself this year will have a 3 lakh crore capital expenditure. The large industry has been borrowing more from the bond market than from the banks itself in many cases. And therefore, that's a problem which has today to be addressed squarely by us. And we are in the process of doing that. I can assure you that the indifference in dealing with that problem when it was taking place, and then during the period 2012 to 14, of just looking the other way, really hasn't solved, is not going to be the approach of this government. There may be challenges to take steps. I think it's a situation which I'm sure we'll be able to respond to appropriately. I must say that India at 70 is an India which we look up to, where we want to continue to occupy that place of a fast-growing economy. And if you look at the nature of expenditure, it's not merely infrastructure that I mentioned. Each scheme of this government, which is addressed to the poor, and therefore blending this with the needs for providing a better quality of life to them. So you are perceiving of each village to be connected by a road by 2019, each village to be electrified by the beginning of next year, and then within each village, each house to get the electricity connection. And you have a time bound till 2018 end to reach that. One of your more successful programs is to make sure that every poor house has a toilet. You have, for urban and rural housing, one of the largest programs which is available. Each house has to have a cooking gas connection. For the poor, even subsidized. And therefore, each one of your schemes, a bank account of each home, a direct transfer of cash into those bank accounts, and these are literally hundreds of millions of bank accounts now. So they have some money in those bank accounts. You incentivize them with the very low-cost insurance policies, and therefore you blend, you continue to expand on your food program, on your work program in rural areas. We are spending actually more, even though some of those programs were initiated by the previous government, because the resource availability is larger. And therefore, the entire advantage of an additional resource, which comes out of growth, is then blended with the needs of these sections of society. This is how India at 70 is what we visualize. Obviously, when India is at 70, there are always attempts to change the narrative itself. And I must confess that I do not have the luxury as yet of being a former finance minister. Nor do I have the luxury of being a former finance minister who's turned a columnist. And therefore, I can conveniently forget a policy paralysis. I can conveniently forget the 15% NPAs of 1998-2002. I can conveniently forget the 4 billion reserve left in 1991. And I can switch over and change a narrative. I recollect in 1999, when I first entered Parliament, probably on the first or the second days, there was a major controversy involving an issue related to the Bofors case, and the government asked me to speak. I had joined as a minister. I became an MP a few months later. So after I finished my speech, our senior leader, Mr. Advani, who was sitting next to me, he congratulated me and emotionally held my hand and made a very interesting comment which I've repeated in the past. And he said, when you speak in Parliament or outside, speak on issues, avoid speaking on persons. I then, of course, I may have breached this rule once in a while, but I tried to follow it as far as possible. Now, I have some very distinguished predecessors in my present job, one of whom is a former president, one is a former prime minister. And I'm certainly not referring to them. The others have decided to act in concert. Because speaking on persons and then bypassing the issues is something which is very easily done. So I did my little research today. Only to just bring out 4 or 5 sentences, if you'll bear with me. One said of the other, Chidambaram will have to be born again to match my record as a finance minister. He then linked Finance Minister Chidambaram to an incompetent doctor for failing to curb India's alarming fiscal deficit. And then he went on. And he said, I accuse him of running the economy down to the ground. He then said that Chidambaram is the most conceited person. He then went on to accuse him of bugging his phones. Today, with complete responsibility, I want to say, when I raised the issue of Aircel Maxis, Chidambaram ordered my phones to be bugged. The other one was not to be left behind. And he said, I thought Shri Sinha would be happy to remain a distant memory for the people of India. However, since he seems determined to remain relevant in his party, I am obliged to recall his record during his 4 years as finance minister. I may point out that in 2000, 2001, and 2002, 2003 were the worst years since liberalization in terms of growth, and Prime Minister Vajpayee had then to force him out and replace him. Well, I'm glad they didn't have Mr. Advani to advise them. But then acting in tandem itself won't change the facts. Probably a more appropriate title for your book would have been India at 70, Modi at 3.5, and a job applicant at 80. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaitley. Finally, may I call upon the founder, publisher, Wisdom Tree, Mr. Shobit Arya, to please give the vote of thanks.
Mr. Arun Jaitley, Union Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, Mr. Swapan Das Gupta, Professor Bibek Debroy, Shri Shakti Sinha, Mr. Ashok Malik, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, distinguished guests and friends. I would like to share an interesting thing about this book, which is that it is not just the text in the book, but even the making and the production of the book that captures the working of the Modi government. This book really was amongst the first ones to go for printing after the new GST law came into being. And there was a lot of anxiety in both the publishing and printing fraternity because an 18% tax rate was imposed on printing of books at unit cost, while in the earlier scenario it used to be nil under VAT. Now, believe it or not, actually, even before the book was printed and an invoice could be raised, and Finance Minister spoke about those 8 to 10 hours of GST Council meetings. So really, even before the invoice could be raised, the tax rate was brought down from 18% to 12%. So a big thank you to the Finance Minister on behalf from the whole of publishing fraternity, and of course a bigger thank you for being here today. I can't help but say this, since he's here, that Mr. Minister, would you be so kind now to bring the rate down to 8%? That would really make the book lovers very happy. Talking about happiness, it has been a great joy publishing this book, and I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Debroy, to Mr. Ashok Malik, more so to Dr. Anirban Ganguly,